You have heard it said that history repeats itself. And though this flies in the face of our modern evolutionary view of history, that humanity is moving ever onward and upward, in this case, it seems the cliche proves true. It certainly is biblical. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, "What has been is what will be. And what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Is there a thing of which it is said, 'See, this is new'? It has already been in the ages before us." History is not linear. History is cyclical. Jesus pointed to this cyclical nature of history when, in response to the question of when the end of the age would come, in Matthew 24, verse 3, Jesus said, verse 4, "And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of birth pangs." Jesus, in that text, he compares the convulsions of history to the contractions of labor. They come and they go. They ebb and they flow. But though history is cyclical, it is not endless and it is not pointless. It is moving towards a definite conclusion, just as birth pains do not go on forever, but rather they increase in frequency and intensity until they result in active labor and eventually in birth. In other words, history is not that endless wheel of time imagined by Eastern religions with their doctrine of reincarnation. That's not what Solomon was talking about when he said, "What has been is what will be." Rather, history is more like a cone, spiraling in shorter and shorter revolutions until it finally reaches its definite apex. Now, because history is cyclical or conical, as the case may be, so too is apocalyptic prophecy. In other words, apocalyptic prophecy, like Daniel 7 through 12, very often foretells an event that will end up having multiple fulfillments. The technical term for this is that apocalyptic prophecy is telescopic. It describes a future event, but then telescopes beyond that event to describe multiple similar future fulfillments. It's sort of like driving west on I-70 towards the Rocky Mountains. What looks like one mountain range as you approach is actually several mountain ranges. You drive up and over the front range only to find that there are more ranges yet to come. Prophecy is like that. One of the clearest examples of this phenomenon is found in Matthew 24, in which it is difficult to tell whether Jesus is speaking of the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in the year 70 AD, or whether he's talking about the tribulation to come at the end of the age. And what we find is that Jesus is actually speaking of both. The one, the destruction of the temple in AD 70, is a foreshadowing or a type of the other, the coming of Christ in judgment at the end of the age. And as I mentioned last week, another example of that is the prophecy of the day of the Lord from the book of Joel. According to Peter in Acts chapter 2, that prophecy of the day of the Lord in Joel 2, 28 to 32 was fulfilled at the first coming of Christ. It was fulfilled at the day of Pentecost. But we also find the New Testament employing that prophecy to describe what will be fulfilled ultimately at the second coming of Christ. You could say that the day of the Lord was inaugurated by Christ's first coming, but it will be consummated at Christ's second coming. Or to give you one more example that's more to the point this morning, I place John's statement in 1 John 2:18 in this category as well. John says, "Children, it is the last hour, and you have heard that Antichrist is coming. So now even many antichrists have come," because history is cyclical. Therefore, he says, we know it is the last hour. Well, this morning we're going to unpack the prophecy of Daniel chapter 8, which speaks specifically and primarily of a 2nd century BC Greek ruler by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV, a man who terrorized the Jews from about 171 to 164 BC. And if you find yourself wondering why an entire chapter of the Bible is dedicated to predicting the relatively brief reign of a relatively minor Greek king, it is because Antiochus's reign of terror foreshadows a future reign of terror of another Antichrist, the one whom Paul calls the man of sin in 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Antiochus is a type of that future Antichrist. Therefore, the warning that Daniel issues to the Jews as they are awaiting the coming of the little horn of Daniel 8, Antiochus IV, also functions as a warning to all of the saints as we await the coming reign of the little horn of Daniel 7, who is the final Antichrist. And to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And we must be forearmed if we are going to stand fast in our faith, persevering to the end, while many, Matthew 24 would lead us to believe, most within the visible church will fall away. I remind you that Jesus said in Matthew 24, "And because lawlessness is increased, the love of many will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." So this morning we're going to look at the vision of the ram, the goat, and the little horn of Daniel 8. A vision given to Daniel for the saints of the Old Covenant in order that they might be prepared when this little horn arose, which he did in around 175 BC. But we're going to receive it not just as a history lesson, but rather as a message to the New Covenant saints that will help us prepare to remain faithful as we stand firm against the beasts of our age, looking for that final Antichrist who is to come, of whom we spoke in Daniel chapter 7. So that's the way we're going to approach this chapter, Daniel chapter 8. So let's look first at the vision of the ram and the goat. Look at verses 1 and 2. "In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me," Daniel, "after that which appeared to me at the first. And I saw the vision, and when I saw, I was in Susa, the citadel, which was in the province of Elam. And I saw in the vision that I was at the Ulai Canal." The 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. You'll remember him from Daniel chapter 5. He's the handwriting on the wall guy. His reign began around 553, and so the 3rd year of his reign would be about 550 or 547, depending on which historical schema you accept. The important point to note is that this vision takes place 2 years after the vision of Daniel chapter 7, which we were told was given to Daniel in the 1st year of the reign of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. And it's about 8 to 11 years before the fall of Babylon to the Medes and the Persians. Daniel was very likely not actually physically present in Susa. Rather, I think what we're to understand is that Daniel was transported to Susa within the prophetic vision. He sees himself in Susa, the citadel, standing by the Ulai Canal. Susa was about 220 miles east of Babylon, about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. In other words, it is in what is today southwestern Iran. And the reason Daniel is prophetically transported to this city, Susa, is that the city would soon become an important city within the emerging Persian Empire, which is symbolized by the ram in this vision of Daniel chapter 8. Now, before we move on, I just want to make a quick note about apocalyptic literature. You'll notice that the setting for the vision of Daniel chapter 8 is very specific. Daniel says, I was in Susa, in the province of Elam, standing by the Ulai Canal. And its interpretation is likewise specific. Daniel is specifically told that the ram is the kingdom of Medo-Persia, and the goat is identified as the king of Greece. Its time frame is specific. How long will this last? 2,300 evenings and mornings. That's very different than the setting and the timing and the interpretation of Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, the setting is very general. It simply took place by the Great Sea. Its interpretation is general. The angel simply tells Daniel that the four great beasts are four kings. He doesn't identify them. And the time frame is general. This will take place for a season and a time, for times, and half a time. There's nothing like 2,300 evenings and mornings. So a good rule of thumb when we're interpreting apocalyptic literature, like Daniel, like the book of Revelation, is that our interpretation should be only as specific as the vision allows. Okay? If the vision is specific about people, places, and times, then we can be specific. If the vision is general, then we need to content ourselves with a general interpretation. This one is highly specific, and so you're going to find me getting a lot more specific in my interpretation. Look at verse 3. I raised my eyes and saw, and behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns, and both horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward and northward and southward. No beast could stand before him, and there was no one who could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased, and he became great. Now, I think the best way to approach this chapter is to read the vision and then read its interpretation, which comes later in the chapter. So if you look down with me at verse 20, we'll see the dream's interpretation, the meaning of the ram. Verse 20, as for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media and Persia. All right, so the ram represents the empire of the Medes and Persians. Now, the Medes and the Persians were originally two distinct peoples and kingdoms located within modern-day Iran. All right, the Medes were in the mountainous region to the north and the west. The Persians were in the plains to the south and the east. However, between 553 and 550 BC, in other words, right around the time that Daniel receives this vision, Cyrus the Persian went to war against the Median Empire, and he won, and he absorbed their people and their territory into his own emerging Persian Empire. And so the empire became known as the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, but the Persians were the real power. You'll see this represented by the two horns of the ram, right? The first smaller horn would be the Median king. His name was Astyages. The second larger horn would be the Persian king, Cyrus. Now, this Persian ram then charges west and north and south, which pretty accurately represents the directions of the Persian expansion and conquest. They reached west to Babylon, Syria, and Asia Minor, north to Armenia and the regions around the Caspian Sea. It may help if you open up your maps in the back of your Bible, kind of get a visual of the ancient Middle East. And then south down into Egypt and Ethiopia. The Persian Empire grew massive. It conquered wherever it pleased for over 200 years, from its founding in 550 BC to its defeat at the hand of Alexander's Greek forces beginning about 334 BC. So about 200 years of world history. They're the dominant kingdom on the world stage. At its height, the Persian Empire stretched over 2.1 million square miles. That's massive. From the Balkans in the west all the way to the Indus River in modern-day India to the east. In fact, it was larger than any previous empire before it. Well, look at verse 5. As I was considering, behold, a male goat came from the west across the face of the whole earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between its eyes. It came to the ram with two horns, which I had seen standing on the bank of the canal, and he ran at him in his powerful wrath. I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged against him and struck the ram and broke his two horns. And the ram had no power to stand before him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled on him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead of it, there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven. Now, likewise, the meaning of the goat is spelled out for us down in verses 21 and 22. The goat is the king of Greece, and the great horn between his eyes is the first king. As for the horn that was broken, in place of which four others arose, four kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. So the goat represents the Greek Empire. And the conspicuous horn, verse 5, or the great horn, verses 8 and 21, is Alexander the Great. Now, we met Alexander at the beginning of Daniel chapter 7. Alexander was tutored by Aristotle until the age of 16, and he became king when his father, Philip II of Macedon, was assassinated. Fun fact, he was poisoned to death at his daughter's wedding. He began a military campaign, Alexander did, against the Persian Empire in 334 BC, and he defeated them in a series of battles, the most famous being the Battle of Issus in 333 BC. By 326 BC, Alexander and his forces crossed the Indus River and conquered the Punjab region of northern India. He continued to press even further into India, but eventually had to give up and turn back. Not because he lost, he actually was undefeated in military battles during his life, but his homesick troops were threatening revolt. So Alexander returned to the east, but he died in Babylon in 323 BC at the age of 32. Maybe of malaria or typhoid fever or some other natural cause. Maybe of poisoning. Alexander was a brilliant man. He was a brilliant military tactician. His tactics are still taught in military academies to this day. He never lost a battle. However, Alexander was unable to conquer God, who took his life at the age of 32. The Greek Empire with Alexander in command is represented by the male goat from the west. Greece is west of Babylon and Persia. And he crosses the whole earth without touching the ground, which means he's moving at tremendous speed, which represents the movement of Alexander and his armies as they conquered kings and empires. Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, particularly the battles of Issus in 333 and Gaugamela at 331 BC, are depicted, I think, in verses 6 and 7, when the goat runs at the ram, the Persian Empire, with great speed and powerful wrath, and is enraged against him, and struck the ram, and broke his two horns, and cast him down to the ground, and trampled on him. Alexander's untimely death at the age of 32, I think, is represented in verse 8. When at the height of his power and strength, the great horn is broken, and in its place arise four horns toward the four winds of heaven. Now, as I mentioned a few weeks ago in our study of Daniel chapter 7, Alexander died without appointing an heir. When asked who should succeed him, Alexander reportedly said, the strongest. And clearly there was debate as to whom that title belonged to. And so there followed, after Alexander's death, 20 years of conflict among his generals, eventually leading to the division of Alexander's empire into four sections. A man named Cassander reigned over Macedonia and Greece to the west. Lysimachus reigned over Thrace and Asia Minor to the north. Seleucus reigned over Syria and Mesopotamia to the east. And Ptolemy, Ptolemy, reigned over Egypt to the south. Well, the vision of the ram and the goat does not reveal much more than we already learned at the beginning of Daniel chapter 7, and even from Nebuchadnezzar's dream in Daniel chapter 2. In other words, we already knew that Babylon would be overthrown by the Medo-Persian Empire. Those are represented by the chest or the arms of silver in Daniel 2, or the bear of Daniel 7. And that the Medo-Persian Empire would itself be overthrown by the Greek Empire. That was the midsection or thighs of bronze in Daniel 2, and the leopard with the 4 wings and the 4 heads of Daniel 7. But it's in its description of the little horn that the vision of Daniel 8 begins to break new ground, and we begin to find out things that we didn't know from previous chapters. We've never seen this little horn before in Daniel chapter 8. You say, well, there was a little horn in Daniel chapter 7. Yes, but I want you to note that the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 emerges out of the 4th beast, which is the Roman Empire. This little horn emerges out of the 3rd beast, which is the Greek Empire. You say, well, why would they use the same image to describe 2 different characters? Because history is cyclical, and these 2 characters are types, one of the other. So the previous dreams and visions have skipped right over this little horn and his reign of terror, which we read about beginning in verse 9. Out of one of them, that is, out of the 4 divisions of Alexander's empire, out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great to the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. It grew great, even to the host of heaven. And some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, "How long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state." The interpretation of the little horn begins then down in verse 23. And at the latter end of their kingdom, okay, the 4 kingdoms that emerged out of Alexander's empire, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, not by his own power, and he shall cause fearful destruction and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy man, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. The vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now, with the benefit of what Ian Dugwood calls historical hindsight, right, which is 2020, nearly every Old Testament scholar agrees that this little horn is a reference to Antiochus IV, otherwise known as Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a ruler that emerged out of the Seleucid kingdom of the east in the 2nd century BC. Daniel's vision is received about 375 years before Antiochus rose to power, and it's amazingly detailed and amazingly accurate. So what I want to do is work verse by verse through this vision and its interpretation, and I'm going to show you its fulfillment in the tyrannical reign of Antiochus. So look with me at verse 9. Out of one of them came a little horn, which grew exceedingly great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. So Antiochus IV was one of that line of Seleucid kings, one of the 4 kingdoms that succeeded Alexander, the kingdom of the east. Originally, the Seleucid kingdom comprised Syria and Mesopotamia, but by the turn of the 2nd century, 200 BC, they began pushing south into Egypt and east toward Elymas and Armenia and west toward Palestine, what is called here the glorious or the beautiful land, Israel. Antiochus III, Antiochus' father, he defeated the Egyptians in 198 BC, and so he gained control over Palestine. But then he was defeated by the Romans in 190 BC, and he died shortly thereafter in 187. By 175, after about 12 years of political turmoil, Antiochus IV came to power over the Seleucid kingdom. Right? So the one horn emerging out of the four in verse 9. Verse 10. It grew great even to the host of heaven, and some of the host and some of the stars it threw down to the ground and trampled on them. It's probably best to translate this verse, some of the host, that is, some of the stars, it threw down to heaven. In other words, the host is the stars. They're not two different things. The host, the stars, the host of heaven, the stars, it threw them down to the ground. And I think that's a symbolic reference to the saints. The saints are referred to as stars of heaven in Daniel chapter 12 and verse 3, and as the host of Yahweh in Exodus 7 and 12. In other words, verse 10 is pointing to a great persecution of the saints during the reign of Antiochus IV. And history bears out the truth of this prophecy. In 169 BC, Antiochus invaded Egypt again. On his way home, he was in desperate need of resources to fund his invasion. Warfare then as now is expensive. So where do you get money if you're a 2nd century BC tyrant? Well, Antiochus decided that he knew where some gold was to be had in the temple at Jerusalem. And so he raided the temple treasury in Jerusalem. He killed 40,000 Jews, and he sold another 40,000 into slavery. The following year, Antiochus invaded Egypt again. This time, however, he was not so successful. He was met not only by the Ptolemaic Egyptian army, but he was met by the Romans. And a Roman general by the name of Popilius Laenus met Antiochus and told him that if he proceeded further into Egypt, which Rome now considered under their protection, that Antiochus would face the full fury of Rome. And then he did something that you just can't make this up. This is a historical, fascinating little fact. He took a stick and he drew a circle around Antiochus in the sand. And he told Antiochus that he wanted his answer before he exited that circle. If he exited towards Egypt, he would die, and if he exited back home, they would let him go. Hence arose the phrase to draw a line in the sand. Look it up. Anyway, humiliated and defeated then, Antiochus returned home and he poured out his rage upon Israel. He looted and he pillaged Jerusalem. He took some inhabitants as slaves, others he killed. He built a fortress within the walls of Jerusalem overlooking the Temple Mount, and he stationed a garrison there. But above all of this, Antiochus decided that he was going to destroy the faith and practice of the Jews. Verse 11 rather. It became great, even as great as the prince of the host. And the regular burnt offering was taken away from him, and the place of his sanctuary was overthrown. And a host will be given over to it together with the regular burnt offering because of transgression. And it will throw truth to the ground, and it will act and prosper. According to the Jewish historian Emil Schur, Antiochus ordered the abolition of the temple cult and the abolishing of the observance of the law and the substitution of pagan cults. The observance of all Jewish ordinances, in particular those relating to the Sabbath and to circumcision, was prohibited on pain of death. In every town in Judea, sacrifice was to be offered to the heathen gods. Overseers were sent everywhere to see that the royal command was carried out, and where the people did not comply willingly, they were obliged to do so by force. Once a month a check was made, and whoever was found with a scroll of the Torah or a child who had been circumcised, they were put to death. On the 15th of Kislev, which is in the month of December, 167 BC, a heathen altar was built in Jerusalem over the top of the great altar of burnt offering, and on the 25th of that month, the first heathen sacrifice was offered upon it. Specifically, Antiochus sacrificed a pig on the altar of the Lord, and he placed within the Holy of Holies an image of Zeus. Now, admittedly, the language of these verses is problematic. You may be reading it and you're asking, how could it be said that the little horn became as great as the prince of the host? That seems like a blasphemous statement, doesn't it? Prince of the host is Yahweh. Well, I think this is meant to emphasize the enormity of Antiochus's arrogance and blasphemy. If you look down at verse 25, notice that Daniel says, in his own mind, he shall become great. In other words, in Antiochus's own mind, he becomes as great or greater than the God of Israel, which is, in his own mind, evidenced by the fact that he has succeeded in desecrating the God of Israel's house. He named himself Epiphanes, a title he had minted on his coins. Epiphanes is Greek for God made manifest. That's what he thought of himself. God in the flesh. But this God made manifest died of disease in Armenia in 164 BC. And I want you to listen to the way the book of 2 Maccabees, that's the Jewish history of these events. Listen to the way the book of 2 Maccabees records Antiochus' death and interprets it as a judgment from God. 2 Maccabees 9:5. But the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. For as soon as he had spoken these words, that he would destroy Jerusalem and make it a burial ground for the Jews, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torments of the inner parts, and that most justly, for he had tormented other men's bowels with many and strange torments. And thus he that a little afore thought he might command the waves of the sea, so proud was he beyond the condition of man, and weigh the high mountains in a balance, he was now cast on the ground and carried in a horse litter, showing forth unto all the manifest power of God. So that the worms rose out of his body, the body of this wicked man, and while he lived in sorrow and pain, his flesh fell away, and the filthiness of his smell was noisome to all of his army. And the man, listen to this, the man that thought a little before that he could reach to the stars of heaven, no man could endure to carry for his intolerable stink. God made manifest, indeed. One further issue in these verses I think needs to be resolved. Verse 12 says that the host was given over to the little horn, and the regular burnt offering was stopped because of transgression. In other words, the saints were given over to death and suffering, and the temple worship ceased because of sin. Whose sin? Whose transgression was to blame for God giving them over in this way? Well, I take this to be a reference to the transgression of Israel. Israel, as a nation, was given over to the little horn as an act of judgment from God, and even the saints within that nation suffered as a result. And I don't think this should surprise us, because we know from the prophets of the post-exile, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, that when Israel returned from exile in Babylon to the promised land, they did not return to faithfulness. So like Nebuchadnezzar, Antiochus was God's instrument of judgment upon Israel. Verses 13 and 14. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to the one who spoke, For how long is the vision concerning the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over of the sanctuary and host to be trampled underfoot? And he said to me, For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary shall be restored to its rightful state. I think we should interpret the regular burnt offering, the transgression that makes desolate, and the giving over the sanctuary and the host as descriptive of this one event. And I think this one event is the desecration of the temple of God that occurred in 167 BC. So the question is, how long will God give his people over to suffer under the tyrannical reign of Antiochus, the little horn? And the answer that is given is quite specific: 2,300 evenings and mornings. Well, that creates another interpretive difficulty. Does this mean 2,300 days, understanding evening and morning as descriptive of one day, which would amount to about 6.5 years? You don't have to get your calculator out. It's about 6.5 years. If that's correct, then it's probably an allusion to the entire time that Antiochus terrorized the Jews, from about 171 to 165 BC. Or is evenings and mornings a reference to the evening and morning sacrifice, such that 2,300 evenings and mornings is 2,300 sacrifices, therefore 1,150 days? Again, just trust me, you don't have to get your calculator. 1,150 days, roughly 3 years. I prefer the second interpretation because I think the focus of these verses is on the desecration of the temple. And we find that between about December 167 and December 164, the regular sacrifices ceased. The people of Israel regarded, after Antiochus sacrificed the pig on the altar and put the statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies, they considered the temple defiled. They would not offer any sacrifices upon it until the temple had been cleansed, which would happen in 164. So I take 2,300 evenings and mornings to be a reference to a little over 3 years. That is the time in which there were no sacrifices offered because of the defiling and the desecration of the temple. Skip down to verse 23. And at the latter end of their kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their limit, a king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. All right? The latter end of that is the 4 kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's empire, that's easy. Antiochus IV came to power in 175 BC, about 150 years after Alexander's death. And after Antiochus's death, the empire just continued to diminish and decline until they were eventually overthrown by the Roman general Pompey in 63 BC. I understand the transgressors of verse 23 to be a reference to the apostate nation of Israel, not the saints within Israel, but the nation as a whole that had embraced Greek culture and religion rather than remaining faithful to God and to his covenant. That's why the judgment of God came upon them in the form of Antiochus. It says that Antiochus is one of bold face, which is translated by one Old Testament scholar as hard, determined, unyielding, adamant, which is certainly descriptive of Antiochus IV. But what does one who understands riddles mean? Well, again, the same Old Testament scholar translates this as one who practices deceit, is a master of dissimulation, is able to conceal his meaning under ambiguous words, and so disguising his real purposes. In other words, what's being described here is that Antiochus is a master manipulator and a deceiver. Before he brought a full frontal attack upon the faith and practice of Israel, he tried to tempt them through the back door by importing Greek culture and Greek religion in through the back. And he attempted to overcome Israel that way. Verse 24, his power shall be great, but not by his own power. And he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. All right, so we've discussed Antiochus' reign of terror over Israel already. We'll go into more detail when we get to Daniel 11, which likewise deals with the intense persecution of the saints under Antiochus IV. For today, I just want you to note 2 things. Number 1, God raised up Antiochus. to great power in order to accomplish his purpose, which was judgment. He did not arise by his own power, he rose by God's power, and God used him to judge and chastise his people. And just as God raised him up, so God will put him down. Number two, the saints are the special object of Antiochus's wrath, which once again points to a demonic energy pulsating through each of these beasts. This is just as much a spiritual conflict as it is a human one. Verse 25, finally. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand, and in his own mind he shall become great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even rise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but by no human hand. Right? So we've already seen one who understands riddles means he was a manipulator. He practiced deceit. Now he is described as one who by his cunning makes deceit to prosper in his hand. And I think once again that refers to his policy of trying to make Israel Greek, even before he came with his forces to attack them. Before Antiochus directly attacked Jewish culture and religion, he sought to infect Jewish culture with Greek culture and with pagan practices. And we will find in Daniel chapter 11 that it worked. Many Israelites were tempted into betraying their covenant with God as a result of all of the things that the Greeks had to offer. And as we have seen, Antiochus' primary enemy was not Israel, it was Israel's God. So verse 25 says, he shall even rise up against the prince of princes. But that was a battle that Antiochus could not win, and in 164 BC he was broken not by any human hand, but by the direct judgment of God. So far we have looked at the vision of the ram, the goat, and the little horn, and we've seen its interpretation. Okay? We've studied the vision's historical fulfillment in the reigns of the empire of the Medes and Persians, in Alexander and the Greek Empire, and in the tyrannical, demonic reign of Antiochus IV. What I want to do in the last few minutes this morning is to examine the vision's application to the saints in Daniel's day, and therefore its application to the saints in our own day. Now, understanding the application of this vision requires that we understand the timing of the vision. So I want you to look back with me at verses 15 through 19. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it. And behold, there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near me where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. But he said to me, Understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground. But he touched me, and he made me stand up. He said, Behold, I will make known to you what shall be at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. Look at verse 26. This vision of the evenings and the mornings that has been told is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. Now there's 3 time frames given for the events described in this vision. It is, verse 17, for the time of the end. Verse 19, that takes place at the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. And verse 26, it refers to many days from now. Now, I think the best way to interpret Daniel chapter 8 is to understand the time of the end to be shorthand for the latter end of the indignation, the time of wrath, in verse 19. Which will be many days from now, that is Daniel's day. So I regard the indignation, the time of indignation, the time of wrath, to refer to God's wrath against the people Israel for their continual idolatries and covenant breaking. I think it's a reference to the reign of Antiochus in 171 to 165. After nearly 1,000 years of sin and rebellion and breaking of covenant, God's patience came to an end, and his wrath broke out against Israel, and he sent them into exile in Babylon in 605 BC. But that did not end his indignation. It did not end with the 70 years of exile and the return of Israel to their homeland. As the post-exilic prophets make plain, exile did not cure Israel of their idolatry. They returned to Israel in much the same condition as they were cast out. And God's indignation remained upon them as they served one world empire after another. First the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally, out of the Greek Empire, the Seleucids. The culmination of this indignation then is the reign of Antiochus IV, whom God unleashed upon Israel in judgment for their idolatries. Okay, so don't be distracted by the language of the time of the end, thinking that the primary fulfillment of Daniel chapter 8 is then, at the end of the world. The time of the end is the end of the indignation of God upon Israel for their faithlessness to his covenant. So the primary application of Daniel's vision is to the faithful saints of Israel in Daniel's own day and for the 3.5 centuries that followed up until the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes. Now remember, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. There is a reason why there were a remnant within Israel in that day who remained faithful to the covenant, even while everyone else abandoned it under threat of persecution. They had been forewarned, and they were therefore forearmed. Daniel 8 is a call to covenant faithfulness, even in the midst of the most severe persecution Israel had known to that date. But does that mean that Daniel 8 has no application to the saints who have lived in the past 2,200 years since Antiochus' death? No. Daniel 8 was written for us as well. Why? Because history is cyclical. What has been will be again, says Solomon. There's nothing new under the sun. Now, you're going to have to take my word for it now, but we will see in chapters 11 and 12 how the prophecy of Antiochus IV merges seamlessly into a prophecy of the Antichrist. In other words, Antiochus IV, the little horn of Daniel 8, is a miniature version of the end-time Antichrist, who's the little horn of Daniel chapter 7. And Antiochus' reign of terror, 161 to 164 BC, is a foreshadowing of the reign of terror to be perpetrated by the man of sin at the end of the age, which means that the application of Daniel 8 to the saints in Daniel's day is a reflection of the application to the saints in our own day. So what is that? I'm going to leave you this morning with 3 thoughts to take away. I understand that this has been largely a historical message. It could not be otherwise. The primary reference of Daniel chapter 8 are to events that happened 2,200 years ago. But here's 3 thoughts to take home with you as we prepare for our own endurance of the reign of terror that is to come. Number 1, just as the reign of Antiochus IV was preceded by a general apostasy of Israel, which in their day took the form of mass adoption of pagan Greek culture and religion, if I read the New Testament right, then so will the reign of the Antichrist at the end be preceded and bring to a culmination the apostasy of the visible church. Now, I'm going to have a lot more to say on that point when we get to Daniel chapter 11. For now, again, remember, there's nothing new under the sun. History repeats itself. And so we read in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, Paul tells the church at Thessalonica, "Let no one deceive you in any way, for the final day, will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of destruction." Likewise, Jesus warned in Matthew 24, "Many false prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold." They'll commit apostasy. They'll fall away. But it's the one who endures to the end who will be saved. Therefore, as we look out and we see a church, predominantly an American church, becoming increasingly worldly and increasingly pagan, just like Israel prior to Antiochus's day. This should spur us on to an increased determination to remain faithful to the covenant no matter the cost, and no matter how much it comes against the tidal wave of pagan culture that is sweeping this nation. The indignation is coming, the culmination of which will be the emergence of the man of sin. 2 Thessalonians 2, 9 through 10, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan, with all power and false wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. So application number one is don't be like that. Love the truth and be saved. Don't be like the vast majority of the visible church when the end comes, that has become so worldly, it's indistinct from the world. And when the line in the sand is drawn, not by a Roman general, but by God himself, much of the church falls on the wrong side. Love the truth and be saved. Second, though the reign of the Antichrist will be terrible, and many of the faithful, the saints, will lose their lives, his reign will be brief. We saw that in Daniel chapter 8, right? 2,300 evenings and mornings, and then he's broken. And we see it in the New Testament as well. Matthew 24:21, for then there will be great tribulation, such as not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be. And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. They're going to be terrible, but they're going to be brief. So if we hold on and endure to the end, we will live to see, or remain faithful, perhaps die to see, the Antichrist broken, but not by any human hand. 2 Thessalonians 2:8, then the lawless one will be revealed after the apostasy comes, the lawless one whom the Lord Jesus will kill with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. So the end has already been determined. The result is announced. Victory is certain. We need only hold on to Christ for a little while, and we'll see the day of redemption dawn. Finally, number 3. Until that day, until the final Antichrist appears, whom the Lord Jesus will destroy and bring to nothing, we will remain subject to the various beasts and horns of this age. Nothing new under the sun. 2 Thessalonians 2:7, for the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Paul said that 2,000 years ago. It's still true today. The mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it keeps it from overwhelming its bounds. He will do so until he is out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed. So the mystery of lawlessness, it's already at work. The spirit of Antichrist, for John 4:3, is already in the world. Even now, many Antichrists have already come, 1 John 2:18. John says this is how we know it is the last hour. It's been the last hour since the first century. It's even more the last hour now. And so it will be to the end of the age. That end may come in 2 days or 2 weeks, 200 or 2,000 years. We don't know, and neither does any man or angel of heaven. But it is coming. And until it does, we have a job to do. Look at Daniel 8:27. And I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for some days. Then I rose, and notice this phrase, and I went about the king's business. But I was appalled by the vision, and I did not understand it. So be appalled by this vision of the end. Be overcome by it. And let that spur you on to be ready when that day comes. But then rise up and go about the king's business. Matthew 24:14, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Daniel 12:3, and those who are wise, This is in the aftermath of the vision of Daniel 11, the vision of Antiochus that leads into the vision of the Antichrist. This is how he concludes it. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. I take that to mean that the king's business is to proclaim the gospel of the kingdom throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and to live wisely and faithfully in this present age, turning many to righteousness. So let's pray, and then let's go out from here and get about the king's business.